beyond the statistics that bite you down. It is all a machine made to hide your greatness. You, we will be resilient. We will overcome. That even though everything will be against us, we are exactly what this world needs. Because you see, they put us behind bars just so we wouldn't raise it. Let me make it clear. We started from the bottom, but we weren't given bootstraps, so we coming up on our own here. We will be the unexpected, the underdog, the unforeseen, the unruly. We will break molds, shake statistical status quo, deconstruct the powers that be. And even though we've had way too many innocent fallen soldiers, like Trayvon Martin, Fong Lee, Andy Lopez, Mike Brown, you will follow the bloodlines and legacies of Cesar Chavez, Richard Aoki, Nelson Mandela. And just like them, you will be a champion. You will not let this world change you. You will change this world. Sincerely, brother from another mother.
So hello, and Ryan, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I am very, very happy and thrilled to be with you today and have the opportunity to share a little bit. I'm going to run through this quickly. I know you heard a little bit about me, but I am 48 years old, an African-American male, husband and father of 3, educator for 26 years, 20 of which as a high school administrator, principal at Liberty High School for 9 years, speaker, professional development provider, and lover of research on trauma and male students of color. I ask you to take a moment and just look at this picture. And what I'd like you to do is just picture yourself entering this particular Wawa. And just think that, remember, you know, you're entering this Wawa after working all day, you're starving, and you've been thinking about that Snickers bar, right? That you know your significant other won't let you have, right? But you've been thinking about it all day. And you walk into this Wawa, you grab that Snickers bar, and it's now in your hand. And I want you to take a moment and think about the first thing that pops into your head. The first thing, when you grab that Snickers bar, the first thing that pops into your head. Now, I want you to hold on to that thought, and we'll come back to it at the end. So just hold on to that. A couple points of engagement. I'm going to go through a lot today. I'm going to move pretty fast because there's a lot of information. And there's just so much that I want to get across to everyone's ears. But there's a lot to process. So take care of yourself. Do what you need to do. Be open. Hopefully, be open to learning and hearing new ideas. And during the Q&A, I hope to learn a lot from you. So hopefully, you stick around for that. And then at the end, if you want to talk further, I'm here. If you want to email me further, feel free. I'm always up for the conversation on this very, very important topic. Our foci for today. This presentation will provide a principal's perspective on some of the systemic inequalities and inequities experienced by youth in the American school system. In addition, we'll discuss the impact of racial and economic conditions on the success of the educational process. This is an important topic to address as we reimagine the evolution of schools post-COVID. More specifically, we're going to define the difference between equality and equity, examine the historical context that has brought us to our current conditions of inequity, describe the systemic challenges regarding inequality and inequity, identify the immediate impact these challenges have on students of color and those most in need, and discuss ways to improve outcomes for students. In the words of the magnificent Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better. So I need to state as we begin this that the information that I'm giving to you represents the experience of some students. It emphasizes public education because 90% of our American students go to public schools, and the majority of my experience is in public education. So excuse my bias. It only examines the impact of race and socioeconomic status on access to education. There are so many other ways to get at this concept of equity, but I'm looking solely at those two. I'll hit a few of the others, but really that's the focus. And the information is derived from published studies, personal research, and my own 26 years in the field of education. So the first question is, what is the difference between equality and equity? Before I go any further, we need to define these terms. Now, I don't mean to be condescending, but they're very often used interchangeably, and they have some different meanings. So if you look at this picture, on the left, you see the term equality, and you'll notice that there are 3 boxes under the 3 students, or 3 children. Those boxes are the same, right? Now you look on the right and you see equity, and those boxes are different. Equality is giving every kid the same thing. You can see that this is a problem, considering the height of the kids reaching for the apple. Giving each kid the same thing does not ensure equal access. Equity is giving every student what they need when they need it. The second scenario provides some kids more than others, i.e. the bigger boxes. So all kids have the same access to the apple. This is the context of those 2 terms in this presentation. Our insincere and ineffective reach for equality as a nation has resulted in an overwhelming urgency for equity. So let's look a little bit of time here at public education. What is public education? Well, we know it's government funded, government run, and it's charged with educating all citizens, right? Particularly students. We know that there's some funding streams for typical public schools. It's generally local taxes at around the 50% range and based on property values. And at the state, there's also state and federal funding, although usually much less, and specific distribution funds, distribution of funds. And then there's charter schools, which are part of the public system and paid by districts of the attending students. Now, understanding that context, there's 2 defining questions. What is the purpose of education? And does every student deserve the same quality of education? Now, I could bore you with a brief history on the progression of modern public education, but here's what I want to say it's important for this particular presentation tonight. Between the 1500s and post-Civil War, there was a mass transformation of education. It went from extensively private for a few to mass free public education for all. It went from heavily religious to industrial, from gender-specific curriculum to slightly less gender-specific curriculum, from rich white exclusivity to non-white male access, but it remained both segregated and inequitable. And at around that time period, we had the establishment of the Federal Department of Education in 1867 to promote student achievement, preparation for students for global competitiveness, educational excellence, and equal access. And so rich white males begin formal education 300 years before everyone else. So when you think about that, what is the impact of a 300-year head start in post-secondary and K-12 education? The next likely question is, will does equality ever enter the education scene? Until the end of the Civil War, non-whites received extremely limited access to formal education, and most white women received what you'd call domestic training. In fact, multiple layers of litigation, meaning government-sponsored and court-approved, were passed to dehumanize all Black and Native American people. all over the colonies and then later throughout the country, making these groups subhuman. In this way, made teaching enslaved people to read illegal, impractical, and quite frankly, dangerous. So when you think about the establishment of colleges, the first college, Harvard University, was established in 1636. The first Black man didn't enter college until 1835. The first woman, 1837, both at Oberlin. Now, we need to ask, were these conditions strategically and purposefully designed to create a permanent lower socioeconomic class based on race and gender? Just a question. And what is the true impact of the highest court in the land stating that you're 3/5 of a person and not worthy of an education? So we know that there was some equality litigation that occurred. Two of the most famous cases and we know that the Civil War set the stage for African Americans to receive a free public education. In 1896, we had Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, that created the separate but equal in all public things, which essentially, in reference to schools, barred non-whites from white schools, which were better resourced. That lasted until 1954, in which we had Brown versus the Board of Education, specifically Brown versus the Board of Topeka. And that particular case is often considered monumental in changing that particular policy. It abolished separate but equal schools, closed the Black schools, but unfortunately, integration was very, very slow. So we needed additional litigation to push that forward. But with litigation, right, we have to think, well, it's not difficult to imagine how the historical inequality of American society based on race and socioeconomic status left a considerable impact. But if we litigated and relitigated inclusive schools and decided that schools should educate all students equally, how have we come to see the significant racial and economic disparities that we see today? I thought the US Supreme Court fixed the problem. Well, that brings us to public housing. So I moved us through education history quick for those that are not interested. So that brings us to public housing, which is a major contributor. So we know that the government funded public housing in the 1940s. Now, often people think about public housing as being a minority thing or a poor people thing, but that's not where public housing started. The development of public housing was actually due to a severe housing shortage during World War II. It began for shipyard workers, those individuals who were making things for the war in mass quantities and needed housing. And then it became housing for returning soldiers from war, because during the war, they were not building housing other than for those workers because all the efforts were going towards the war. Well, why is this significant? It's significant because this housing was the first time that the government stepped in and built specific housing that was segregated in integrated neighborhoods. So they went into these inner cities and these port areas that were integrated because of jobs. So people of different races lived around each other and now set up these massive buildings that were specifically segregated. Once this was done over time, we then ran into where subdevelopments started to be built outside of the cities. Now, these subdevelopments were significant because they were for whites only. They were government sponsored, and they became the reason for what we call it in society white flight. So you had white citizens, families moving out of these what considered to be projects or this government housing into the suburbs based through government funding. And that particular funding was specific for white citizens. So that resulted in this government housing within the inner cities to remain just Black, just for Blacks or people of color, and poor people. They were the only ones who remained in the city. But the reality is that the cost to move out of the city for white citizens into the suburbs was about the same as it would cost them to stay in these inner cities. So it made sense to move out. We also have a popular term that has been kicked around in the past decade or so was the term redlining. Well, this was the refusal to show, sell, or mortgage homes for Blacks in white areas. So there specifically was maps that they would draw red lines on and say these areas where you were not permitted to show to Black families. Then we also had the GI Bill, which racialized military jobs. And although it eventually offered the ability to enter college for African Americans and people of color, the problem was that there weren't places to go to college for many of these people of color, and therefore they couldn't access that level of job, and therefore not be able to afford higher paying homes and move in that direction. So this racialized home ownership equated to the modern middle class, the modern white middle class, and minorities were left out of this benefit. So the question becomes, what does this mean for schools? How does this all apply to schools? Well, both the systemic government funding and individual racism impacted people's place of residence, right? It controlled where they ended up living. And we know that residence regulates school assignment. So where you live, generally speaking, controls what schools you go to through most of the country. This results in highly homogeneous schools throughout the metropolitan and suburban areas across the country, both racially and economically. So let's look more closely at the current racial and economic demographics of the US public schools. Sorry, you probably can't see that. It says US public schools. So according to the National Center of Educational Statistics in 2021, in 2017, there were 50 million students enrolled in both our public elementary and secondary schools. 24 million were white, roughly 8 million were Black, roughly 13.5 million Hispanic, and so on. One group that had to be noted was our Latino students were 5% of the US enrollment in 1970, and by 2016, they were 26% of the US enrollment. Pretty impressive growth. The percentage in high poverty schools in 2017 exceeded the percent of low poverty schools, 25 to 21%. And the percent of students attending high poverty schools by race were Black, so these are high poverty schools by race. Blacks were 45%, Hispanic 45%, Native American, Alaska Native 41%, all the way down to white students at 8%. Now, when you flipped it over and you looked at this percent of students attending low poverty schools, it was the exact opposite. So it would be white students, right, who attended the low poverty schools at the highest rate, all the way to Black students who attended at the lowest rate in the lowest poverty schools. A little more evidence to look at here. So recent studies have shown that segregation of Black students has increased in almost every region of the nation. In many of the nation's largest schools, districts, Black students have little access to or interaction with white, Asian, or middle-class students. Substantial Black enrollment has occurred, but in those schools, they've remained considerably segregated. Racial and economic segregation has been unchecked for nearly 3 decades. Segregation has a strong negative relationship with achievement, college success, long-term employment, and income for students of color. New York City remains the most segregated state, New York State, the most segregated state for African-American students. At 65% of African-American students are in intensely segregated minority schools. California remains the most segregated for Latinx students at 58%. and with only 15% attending schools with white classmates. As a result, US schools are more segregated now than they were prior to Brown versus Board of Education. So our inner city schools are more segregated now than they were then. These trends matter for students and for communities whose future are determined by how public schools prepare students for a diverse future. So let's take a specific look at Pennsylvania, okay, as an example. According to research in 2017, PA, Pennsylvania, has the most inequitable school funding in the country. Funding at 60% of local taxes, 34% from the state, and 3% federal. Overall, rich districts in Pennsylvania get 33% more state funding than poor districts. And out of the 500 districts, when coded by race, rankings reveal that districts are receiving increasingly more funding than their fair share as they get increasingly more white. As a result, PA adopted a fair funding formula, but only applied it to 6% of the allocated budget. Now, if you applied the fair funding formula to 100% of the allocated budget, the Bethlehem Area School District and the Allentown School District, your two most urban schools in the Lehigh Valley, would receive 25 million and 80 million additional dollars, respectively. So what is the impact of inequitable funding on our schools? Well, schools are a mirror image of our community and our society. When you look at economic resources, disparate school experiences, and vastly different life outcomes, they all are at play. Underfunded schools are often in poorer communities, unable to provide advanced academic opportunities for their students, are working with students in more difficult living conditions, have higher concentrations of students of color, are in areas with substandard mental and physical health care, resulting in attendance and engagement concerns, are in areas of higher rates of community violence and police activity, and are navigating staffing concerns more often due to cost of living, travel, and safety. So, how are schools currently battling these social conditions? Well, school districts have witnessed the significant decrease in community services for families. Our governments have allowed this to happen and placed the challenge on our schools, our public schools. Many schools have chosen to place student well-being above test scores, which they really should. We know that if students' needs are not being met, they can't learn effectively. And you can just refer to Maslow's hierarchy, I'll talk about a little later. Many schools are providing social services to meet the vast needs for students. That includes food, clothing, vision health, medical health, dentists, employment, etc. These services are funded by hiring qualified staff or contracting with partners. Now, this requires a reallocation of academic program dollars to social service costs. So, where is the need for equity in this? Well, schools without these concerns can focus their energy, time, and resources on academic learning. So, what's the impact in terms of school accountability measures? I mentioned testing earlier. Well, federal and state accountability requires that we measure certain things, right? We all know that. Well, the question is, do we measure what actually matters? Now, the state has us measure reading, math, and science, or English, math, and science, depending on the level, right? But why not hope levels? Why don't we measure connectedness or the way in which we fill students' needs, their mental health concerns, or overall wellness. You see, in the aggregate, school performance on state assessments can be accurately predicted by the economic demographics of the school. The poorer the school, the lower the performance on standardized tests. We know that higher numbers of minorities live in poverty, and it results in the perception that minorities do poorly in school. But the reality is that poverty equates to a lack of resources, and that lack of resources equates to poor performance on standardized tests. So what's the representation in advanced academic spaces? Although the research says that talent is randomly distributed among the population, students of color remain the significant minority in highly challenging academic programs. So if we look at K-12 schools, gifted representation. Nationally, African Americans, Latinx, and Native American families are underrepresented in gifted programs by 43%, 30%, and 13% respectively, as of 2016. They're underrepresented in advanced placement in international baccalaureate programs, dual enrollment, and college course going during high school. In addition, they're well underrepresented in undergraduate special programs, such as study abroad, internships, and advanced research. Now, one of the big ones that is always on my mind, the impact on mental health. Mental health challenges are an epidemic in the childhood and adolescent community. I repeat, it is an epidemic. Often inequality is or manifests into what we call ACEs. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. These are negative experiences that occur prior to the age of 18. They include things like prejudice, drugs, neglect, poverty, divorce, witnessing violence, etc. And the effect can severely impact learning, memory, behavior, relationships, short and long-term emotional and physical health. Many students of color experience ACEs at higher rates than their white peers, and therefore may be forced to navigate more challenging academic barriers. In fact, urban youth are twice as likely to experience PTSD than soldiers coming home from war. I'll say that again. Urban youth are twice as likely to experience PTSD than soldiers coming home from war. In fact, they've changed the name to CPTSD, or complex PTSD, because these students don't leave the battlefield, but go home to it each day. And yet, we don't provide educators with any training in PTSD. We have communities where 50 to 60% of the childhood population enter school with trauma disorders because of what they've witnessed or experienced. Now, what is the impact on school discipline and arrests? That's one that's often talked about. Well, we know that there's some negative perceptions. Studies have shown that students of color, especially males of color, are perceived to be much older than their actual age. This perception, in concert with systemic and personal biases, is believed to yield disparate school discipline and juvenile justice outcomes. So, looking at school discipline, research consistently finds that students of color receive more frequent suspensions, longer term suspensions, and more frequent referral to law enforcement than their white peers for the same offenses. Specifically, Black students were suspended 103 days of school per 100 students enrolled, which is 82 more days than their white peers. Looking at criminal justice, the US has by far the highest imprisonment rate in the world. We have a juvenile justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. According to Brian Stevenson, 70% of people of color who drop out of high school will spend some time in jail or prison. Based on our current mass incarceration rates, 1 in 3 Black male babies and 1 in 6 Latino male babies born today will spend some portion of their life in jail or prison. The United States remains the only country in the world that sentences 13-year-old children to die in prison, many of which are male students of color. So, if students of color are unfairly perceived to be older and therefore know better, serve suspensions and arrests at disparate rates, losing massive amounts of time in academic settings, within a system of unhinged mass incarceration, which disproportionately and unfairly affects Black and brown people, why are we so confused about the negative outcomes for students of color? Now, you have to ask, what is the collective impact of navigating these structures? Inequitable access, resources, and treatment are going to yield results in disparate outcomes. But how does growing up in a highly inequitable society impact students? Now, we could spend the entire week discussing the racial, economic, political, and social inequalities. The question is, how do these real and perceived inequalities impact the most vulnerable youth that we teach? When you know that drug use is slightly higher for whites, but drug arrests are double for Blacks. When you visually process the George Floyd execution, what does that do to male students of color? When you know that your school is falling down and you can't take the classes that you're passionate about, yet the school 2 miles down the road has college-level facilities. What happens to your self-worth? When the former president of your country openly states his case can't be tried by a Mexican judge, how do our Mexican brothers and sisters feel about that? How are our children affected by these actions and conditions in our society? Well, we know that some students are thriving, but many are just surviving. Many students of color know what it means to be ignored, abandoned, and hunted by your own government. According to Dronde in 2018, growing up in communities with abundant resources and equitable treatment allows children to expend energy on personal growth and see a reason to stretch. Researchers have found that inequality has considerable long-term impacts, not just socially and economically, but health-related as well. So as a result, some students experience academic disengagement, goal-setting stagnation, an assumption of diminished reward, damaged hope levels, and an extinguished faith in the American dream. Now, you take all of that, and then you recognize that we were hit by this worldwide pandemic. So what happens to all of that under these conditions? Well, we know that there was an incredible intensification of financial instability in many of these families, a revealing of discriminatory practices across the gamut, forced that these schools were, many of the people who were in these school districts were forced into an online situation for their academics. And we know that many of the schools who were in these situations had poor air quality, so they couldn't hold classes within their buildings. So now we have schools in which have buildings that they can't occupy, they have limited access to technology, and these students go home to, many of them go home to homes that have limited access to Wi-Fi. So what kind of challenge is that? We know that there were significant mental health concerns prior to the pandemic. Remember I said it was an epidemic before the pandemic hit. And these students went to online learning. Now, many students receive the only mental health support they get within their schools. So now you're home, so what mental health support are you receiving? According to the CDC, there has been a 24% spike over the last year in emergency room visits for mental health issues among 5 to 11-year-olds. Once again, there has been a 24% spike in emergency room visits for mental health issues for 5 to 11-year-olds, and a 31% increase among 12 to 17-year-olds. We know that this pandemic has caused many of our students to be in a position where they need to support their families. So even if their schools were working, they had to go to work. We know that there's now a new questioning of what's relevant educational content. I tell the students that the teachers that I serve, that if now in this day and age, if the content that they're teaching is Googleable, well, it's somewhat irrelevant. We know, most importantly, that the pandemic has caused massive, widespread disengagement from school. Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan stated that the implications are especially dire for up to 24 million students at risk of dropping out of school permanently due to rising levels of child poverty associated with the pandemic. And finally, as we all know, there's been incredible disconnection between people. For many students of color, their connection to people has been key to their success. This disconnection has been horrible for these students. Now, in light of all this, I need to ask, why does this inequality seem to be okay? Why don't we enact equity, the equity model that our youth need to heal? We've allowed ourselves to be distant from the most needy children, a complete lack of proximity to the pain and suffering of our most vulnerable youth. We've totally bought into the politics of fear and anger. Some of us are old enough to remember the term super predators that was placed on many of our children of color. We were told to be afraid of these children and strike back against them with anger. As described by Brian Stevenson, there's a presumptuous myth of dangerousness that was assigned to Black and brown children. We know children are existing without basic needs being met. And then we expect them to perform as well as those with every benefit. As a nation, we have the ability to change these things. But can we show the commitment and willingness to do what's necessary to fix it? Now, I ask you, if you were someone who was consistently portrayed negatively in society, disproportionately impacted by many of these social structures that I mentioned, poverty, racism, etc. You were one of the few in the advanced academic spaces, navigating significant inequality, disproportionately impacted by mental health and what we call ACEs, and living under these conditions in an intensified state due to the pandemic. Who would you be? This is one of my favorite quotes, my most impactful quotes that I want to share with you. The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Truly impactful. Now, considering the inequalities and inequities that some students face, do educators, schools, and communities have a responsibility to create more responsive learning environments? According to Dr. Jeff Duncan Adrande, committing to proximity, personal connection, and relevant, relatable content is more important now than ever. So let's talk a little bit about our educators. There are three things that I want to state up front, and I call the educator's Achilles heel. These are three of the most significant mistakes that educators make when working with not just male students of color, but students of color in general. We fear, pity, or try to fix our students of color. Now, fear leads to purposeful avoidance of the student. You see, you can't teach someone that you fear, and you can't learn from someone that fears you. Then pity. Pity usually leads to the removal or decrease of expectations for the student. Lowering the bar communicates that the student can't and you must give it to him. That's not good for the student or the teacher. And then finally, fixing. Fixing people often disempowers them. Students of color are not broken. The systems they exist in are. All three of these result in a substandard education that leaves both the student and the educator in a state of potential failure. So, what can educators do? Now, there's a lot here, I admit, and I'm going to hit a couple of them, but they're all so important. Now, these things are not groundbreaking, and they'll work with all kids, but they're critical for so many students navigating these environments. First and foremost, always refer back to Maslow. Now, for those that don't know, those that aren't in education, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is basically built on the fact that students' needs must be met, and there's a hierarchy for those needs. The ones on the bottom, like a pyramid, need to be met first. So it starts with physiological needs, then it moves to safety needs, then love and belonging, then self-esteem, and then eventually to self-actualization. Self-actualization is where true learning occurs. So if a student, if you think about that pyramid, if any of those blocks are missing, those needs aren't being met, the student can't self-actualize the way they should. So as educators and as people who work with students, younger people, we need to make sure that those needs are being met so that they can self-actualize. Next, we need to admit our biases, which we all have. Don't be colorblind. It was for a long time popular to say, I don't see color. Well, when you're working with students of color, that's a problem. If you don't see color, you don't see them. So it's important to not only see it, but celebrate it. Create opportunities for success and healthy competition. Get proximate and form deep connection. It's all about relationships. As Brian Stevenson says, you can't create solutions without being proximate to the problem. Relationships, relationships, relationships. Surround them with positive adults. And there was that old proverb, that old African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. It does. It absolutely does. And we need to surround these students with people that care. I talk at Liberty High School about what's called passion and purpose. We define passion here, that's our mission here at Liberty. And we define passion as what you love, and purpose is what you want to do with what you love. How you want to use your passion to make your community, your country, your world a better place. So we need to make sure that students can identify their why, identify their passion, and understand how it fits in the larger context of doing something bigger than them. Create safe spaces for your students of color. For some, the space that you create may be the only one they have. Believe in them and tell them so. Keep your expectations high with high supports. Don't quit on them. Some of them are expecting it. And most importantly, we have to stop preaching that an education is the way students of color get out of their community. It's the path to helping improve the conditions of their community, not their way out. The purpose of education is not to escape poverty. The purpose of an education is to end it. Now, what can institutions do? Schools, universities, etc. Well, there's a lot that can be done. First, schools need to provide safe spaces. Institutions need to provide spaces for courageous conversation. between students, between staff, and between everyone. The only way we learn and get better is by talking, by having honest conversations and hearing each other. So we need to provide those safe spaces to do that in what they call affinity groups. Conduct professional development on cultural bias and trauma-informed education. Move the conversation from equality to equity. Remember, we created the conditions that we couldn't meet equality that now place us in the position to need equity. Make sure that our curriculums are inclusive and scrutinized with an anti-racist lens. Not always easy to do, but important. Students need to feel like they're a part of what we're teaching. We have to diversify our staff. I know that that's a hard lift in education in general.
I'll put that with the plants. Let me grab the chicken. It's a little weird right now.
But it's extremely important that our staff are diversified. There are studies, there's research that shows that for students of color, the earlier they have a teacher of color, the higher their chances of being successful in high school and attending college. So it's important that our staff reflect the makeup of our students. Create new opportunities for human connection and mentorship, expand our systems and methods of academic and mental health supports, provide social services for our students and our families, medical, dental, vision, food, clothing, mental health, publicly celebrate academic growth and community engagement, design program that reinforces their why, and conduct surveys that help us understand how we're doing as universities and schools, both for students and staff. Now, how can the community be involved in this? Because they're a critical partner. Well, our community has to start to demand that our government make education a priority. Hold our government accountable for providing equitable resources to our schools, especially for our most vulnerable youth, in things like a fair funding formula for the entire budget. Demand that our government provide adequate social services to support families and prevent an overloading on our schools. Stay involved and connected to your children's schools, and establish partnerships with schools that allow for internships and shadow experiences that some students, quite frankly, don't have access to. So students of color, in summation, need educators to provide hope. We are currently, as a society, constantly hearing people yell that Black Lives Matter. Well, you only need to qualify that which doesn't exist. If the world is telling you that you don't matter, how do you maintain hope? We need educators to believe in their ability to achieve. Students of color need to know that their actions can yield successful results. Your positive affirmations confirm that. We need to connect beyond your subject matter. Students of color tend to have barriers that make connection more difficult. If you truly connect with your students of color, they will tear down walls for you. And finally, you need to love them. Just simply love them. Now, at the beginning of this presentation, I asked you to look at this particular store, this happens to be a Wawa, and think about the first thing that came to mind when you walked in and you picked up that Snickers bar or whatever it is you like to eat and grabbed it and had it in your hand. What was the first thing that comes to mind? Now, when I ask this question, normally what people say is, oh, well, I thought about how hungry I am, or I thought about how much it's going to cost, or I thought about, I hope I don't get caught by my wife, right? These kinds of things come up. Here's what I'd say. For me, I am, as you heard, a person with multiple degrees, now Dr. Baily. I stand I'm a long-standing member of the community. I would assume highly respected in my community. And When I walk into the store as an African-American man, the first thing I think about when I pick up an item in the store is that it needs to be visible. I am a well-established professional African-American man, and the first thing I think about is the item needs to be visible. When we have people who have reached the point that I've reached, and that's the way we've been socially conditioned to think, there's a problem in our society. We have the ability to fix this so that children who are coming through in the decades after us don't have to have that experience. The question is do we have the courage to fix it? We need to do better as a society. Our kids deserve better. I want to thank you for sharing time with me. I want to thank you for being here. I hope that some of it made sense. And I am, again, just very, very thankful to Lafayette College for allowing me to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baily. I've got a few claps here in the chat box. If folks have questions, please add them to the chat. I'm going to ask a question. What can members, parents, et cetera, of better funded school districts do to help lesser funded school districts?
So if you take time to look at this, specifically in Pennsylvania, if you take time to look at this and understand how severely inequitable the funding is, you will be blown away by what it really means, boots on the ground for students, not just students of color, poor students in general. And when you understand what districts are dealing with, who don't have the proper funding, and then you think about what districts who do have that, whether it's your own or not, again, you will be blown away. And so what I would say is it's obviously a difficult concept, because often what people think is, well, I don't want to give up. I don't want to lose anything. But the reality is that what you're doing by advocating for poorer districts to get more is you're simply saying, we've gotten more than our fair share for far too long. And so it's important that we now are doing something more equitable and providing these funds to those that need it, right? And so really it comes down to you going to your congressmen and congresswomen and saying, listen, we have to do something about this. We have to. You're either going to pay for it now or you're going to pay for it later. That's just the way it works. And so if we're not investing in children now, then those are the individuals we're going to pay for later. We're going to pay to whatever it costs to house them in prisons. We're going to pay for whatever it costs to take care of them from a mental health perspective. We're going to pay one way or another. I'd much rather be the people who pay to make sure that they receive the education they deserve up front. We go to these congressmen and say, listen, enough of this. We need to do what's right. And on that front end, now we're nurturing the minds that may be the ones who figure this whole thing out. They may be the ones who actually cure poverty, right? Who cure cancer, who do the things that we need to be done in our society. But there are so many minds that are being left unnourished because we're making choices to do what's comfortable versus what's right.
I think we have a few more questions here, maybe kind of
I was comfortable with the quiet. I'm a special ed teacher, so I can wait a long time.
Let's see if I can find one. So I have one here that's kind of in the same line from Irene. How can we change the funding formula? You were speaking about, speaking to your congressperson and.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you are. In Pennsylvania, we've created the system. We now have just refused to invest in it the way we should, right? Fair funding formula makes absolute sense. When you think about this, when you work the fair funding formula out, Allentown School District should get $80 million more than what they're receiving. That is unbelievable. You talk about changing the face of Allentown. You will change the face of Allentown 5 years. It will be a new place when you have that amount of money going into the school system. It's just, it's unbelievable. And so it just depends on where you live. I don't know much about too many other school districts. I just know Pennsylvania. But that's really what it comes to.
Yes, we have another one here from Dave. How do you account for Baltimore school funding highest per capita in the country, but schools are displaying a failure? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you need to know more about exactly what's happening in the school district, right, to determine that. So how those funds are distributed, how they're used, you also have to look at, okay, so you can say in an urban school district that X amount of money is going to that district. But if they also are dealing with, 50% of their schools going to charter schools, well, those funds are not going to the school district. Those funds are merely going through the school district. And I'm not here to say good or bad for charter schools, not by any means, but that's just the reality, right? So you can have a high amount of funds going through your school district, but not necessarily feeding the students within your school district. So it's just something that you need to be aware of.
Yeah,
but
so
every district's different.
that question from Dave went on to ask, what was so different for you to achieve the levels of success you have? Isn't equity trying to assume the same outcome and test results are skewed to reflect that? And are test results skewed to reflect that?
So I'm going to try to gauge the answer. I'm not sure I understand the whole question, but I will say, for me personally, the difference was I had parents and a village of adults who surrounded me, who refused to allow me to fail, who refused to allow me to expect anything other than excellence, right? I had those people around me. Minus those people, I can't tell you who I would be. So, when we talk about the needs of our students, I said it, relationships. And that person doesn't have to look like me. You can be that person, right? It's just making sure that you are there, right? That you're present, that you're providing the feedback and the information to those students. But for me, there is absolutely no doubt. It was about the people that chose to surround me. That, no doubt.
Great, and we've got a good one here from Rose. How can we strengthen our partnership between school systems and healthcare to maximize education and healthcare benefits for our child? She's a pediatrician in North Philadelphia for poverty-stricken community, predominantly, patients of color.
Great question. So one thing, and I'll speak to, so here at Liberty, we're fortunate in that we have created good partnerships with St. Luke's. And what we do at Liberty is we have, they send out a vision van, a medical van, and a dental van to Liberty High School. So I think it's once a week, they rotate through. So our students can get the healthcare that they need. From a mental health perspective, they also do some mental health services, but what we did was we went after a major grant to become, we decided to become a trauma-informed school. Part of that is we decided to create what's called a wellness center here at Liberty High School. And in that, we went out and got a major grant to create the center. We now have 4 social workers that work within Liberty High School. And we also partnered with Moravian College, who sends their occupational therapy students to Liberty. So within our center, we're serving students from a mental health perspective, from an occupational therapy perspective, and then we contracted out through our grant to receive mindfulness programming for all of our students. So every one of my freshmen here at Liberty received mindfulness training for half a semester. And then we also provide mindfulness training and yoga for our students, staff, and parents through that same grant. So it's really about trying to find the funds to make it work. There are so many partners out there. If you walk in with the right, the right plan and talk about how to make this mutually beneficial, they will work with you. They want to get involved. They want to give back, but you have to figure out how to kind of get in and make it work. Our partnerships around the Valley, again, with St. Luke's, with Moravian College, have really been beneficial in terms of health services for the students that I serve.
Great. We've got another one here from Barbara, who asks, are there existing programs for providing training or education about trauma to teachers and staff, or do these need to be created, or is there funding, or is there issue with funding for purchasing of training?
So there is a lot out there, okay? Not all of it's good, but there's a lot out there. At Liberty, what we did was we created our own. So myself and another administrator, we created a committee and we dug in and we created our own training, and which I'll gladly, if you want to reach out, connect with me. I provided the training many times and we've done it at many places. Just let me know and I'll connect with you, but we created it. A great place to start if you're just starting at ground zero is there's a video on YouTube by Nadine Burke Harris. Nadine Burke Harris is the current, she is the, I forget what they call it. She's in California, the Surgeon General, I believe, of California. But she started in on ground zero. If you look at her video on YouTube, amazing video. It changed my whole perspective and really launched us into this process. So I would start there. There's also some other programs. There are two videos that we started on trauma. One's out of Washington. If you reach out to me, email me, I can give you the names. There are two really great videos. But what one of them really does is it really analyzes the Kaiser Permanente study, which was the one that really started the ACEs, the whole ACEs concept. And you can YouTube it as well. But the Kaiser Permanente study was the study that really looked at the correlation between these ACEs and health outcomes. And what they found was absolutely astounding. There was a direct correlation between the number of ACEs a student has, a person has over their life, over their childhood, and long-term disease, specifically the big killers, cancer, heart attack, stroke, right? Those. But it is absolutely amazing to see what they found. And this was a study they did with 17,000 middle-class, mostly white workers in California. And obviously, when they came out with the study, nobody believed it. The medical community were like, "You're crazy. That's not true." And it was then duplicated all over the country. Everybody redid it and found the same exact results. So there is direct correlation between the number of ACEs a person experiences and long-term disease, long-term physical disease, which, right, many medical people always kind of learned about the split between the brain or the emotion and the body. But the reality is they're very, very well connected. So taking care of our students from a mental health perspective is critical. And really the number one fail-safe to preventing students from having, we all experience stress but preventing that stress from becoming toxic is really one caring adult. Most important thing to prevent it from becoming toxic is one truly caring adult. So there's a whole lot out there. Email me, I'll share whatever I have with you.
Great. I think the last question we have here is, for our college students becoming new teachers after graduation, what should our top priorities be for students of color, and what action should we take beyond the classroom?
Is the question about training teachers to work with students of color, or about students of color becoming teachers?
It seems like someone just graduating would like some advice on how to support students of color in and outside of the classroom.
I'll make it easy for you. All those things I put in there. No. Right? I mean, there's a lot. There's so much, right, that you can do. Pick a couple of those things and go at them. But the most important thing is relationships. The most important thing is to connect with the students in front of you. So often as educators, we want to keep an arm's distance. We for whatever reason, we got into this profession because we love working with students, but then we want to keep a distance from them, right? But the reality is the real teaching occurs when we connect. Human connection. If you create that human connection, students will learn from you. Now you got to have something legit to teach, right? But ultimately it's about human connection. Don't keep that arm's length. Connect with them, and you'll make inroads.
Yeah. And I think there's one last thing, actually. If we could go back to your slide with fear, pity, and fix, I think we just want to take another quick look at the translations you have there.
Okay. This slide, I believe you're talking about?
Yep, I think this is it.
Was there a question, or you just wanted to see it?
Yeah, no, this was just to look at the slide. I don't see any other questions in the chat at this point.
I think the question was the translation of that.
So which part?
I'm sorry.
Erin, do you want to?
Yes, I was just trying to write down how fear translates into purposeful avoidance and pity translates into, so I still missed it. I'm sorry.
You know
I'm
what?
a teacher, so I
Do you have my
teach
email?
English language learners. I do.
If you have my email, email me. I'll send you the slide. No problem.
Well, I can drop it in the survey that we're going to send folks later, so that everyone has it.
And
Have it. Contact.
What it really equates to, right, is like, if we fear a student, right, for the first part, right, if we fear them, then it's going to lead to avoidance. I'm going to avoid you. I'm not going to engage in conversation with you. I'm not going to ask you questions. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to not engage, because I'm scared, I'm worried, so I'm going to keep my distance from you, right? Which is the exact opposite. And here's what I can tell you about those students, the students that we tend to fear most. I was an emotional support teacher at Centennial School, which is basically like the Marines of education, right? And at Centennial, the kid who was the toughest nut to crack, when you crack that nut, that kid is yours. He will do anything for you. He will learn anything for you. He will keep the class moving the way you want it to be. He will do anything for you if you connect with that student, because that student has had a history of people who've disconnected. So to feel that connection, that's all, everybody wants it, right? So, but what we tend to do is when we fear them, we disconnect. So that's what I meant by purposeful avoidance. The pity piece, right, is that, when we, oh, I feel sorry for you, right? I feel sorry for you. So instead, now I'm going to remove the expectations. I feel bad that you're in this situation, so you don't have to do anything, right? I'm not going to demand that you learn this material. That's no good, right? You are, in that particular point, you are really putting that student at now a lifelong disadvantage. Because the belief now is, I can't do it. No matter what, I can't, right? Not that this moment I'm struggling. It's that you don't believe that I can do it. So now that self-fulfilling prophecy kicks in and now I can't, right? No good. Pity, no good. And then fixing, right, is just like, as educators, we're all guilty of it. We want to fix problems, right? That's who we are. Like we want to make it better. And that's just, you know, we're disempowering the individual. So we have to help them through it, right? We have to work with them through it. But to just walk in and fix it, chances are we don't even really understand it, right? We don't really even understand what they're going through, what they're dealing with, but we want to fix it. Well, that's not the answer, right? Work with them through it, support them through whatever that struggle is. So that was what I meant by those three things. I hope that helped.
And I did find another question here, which you may not be able to speak to since it's New Jersey based versus PA. Are you familiar with the litigation by the New Jersey Coalition for Diverse and Inclusive Schools, Inc.?
I am not, but it sounds like something I'd like to know about.
Yeah, you should, excuse me, you should look up, there's an organization that is trying to have schools be more magnet schools, inter-county schools and things like that, because New Jersey's, I think, schools are more segregated than New York's and Pennsylvania's by percentage of Afro-Americans or in schools with high percentages of Afro-Americans. So this litigation started a year or two. It's by a fellow, I don't know whether you know Paul Trachtenberg, who is one of the educators in Newark and a former Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, and other justices of the Supreme Court are backing this litigation under New Jersey Constitution of a thorough and efficient education, as an addition to the Abbott cases with respect to finances. So this is the next step after finances.
One of the biggest issues I see in New Jersey, I'm a Jersey kid, is that school districts have purposefully held on to their small enclave districts, right? A lot of K to 8 districts, right? Out of that, I don't want my kid with those kids. That's what a lot of that is. I mean, that's just the truth, right? So we've held on to these small little enclaves, which in reality divides resources exponentially across the state. But in turn, creates a whole lot of segregation. It really does. And a lot of that, to be frank, is purposeful, unfortunately. But yeah, that sounds like some litigation I need to know more about.
Great. Any other questions?
Making yourself what?
Oh, sorry, I see one here. Do you get tired of hearing?
What do I Make yourself tea?
White elitists who say great presentation and have a privileged background that can't really relate to what you're saying?
I don't know, because usually those people don't really say, they don't say more to me, so I don't know that that's their case, right? But here's what I'd say. They're here, right? They're here. I mean, they didn't have to be here. They chose to be here. So whether they're, we're all at different spaces in this continuum. We're not all of us are 100% in and understand it and accept it and want it. Some of us are on the journey towards it. That's okay. That's all right, right? But they're here. My fear is of all the people that aren't here, right? That need to hear it, that need to digest it. We talk about racism often as, kind of like you're like a puddle, right? You're walking past a puddle and it splashes. Well, everybody gets hit with it, right? And so everyone's affected by it. So the question becomes, right, if we know that we all have biases, if we know we all have these issues, then what are we doing about it, right? Are we having conversations? Are we listening? right? Are we just accepting the possibility of a different angle? And so for me, hey, if you grab one thing, if you walked in here an abject, whatever you want to call it, racist, whatever, and you grabbed one thing and you're like, maybe, right? All right, I'll take it. I'll take it. This is we created this system over hundreds and hundreds of years. It's going to take time. And so, I want people to feel good about moving forward. The individuals who choose not to engage and don't want to hear anything about it, don't want to talk about it, and want to just be totally disconnected, those are the individuals I'm worried about.
Great. All right, I think that's all the questions. So again, Dr. Baily, thank you so much. And of course to our audience for coming here to our event. I encourage those of you who may be interested in learning more about the McDonough Network to explore our webpage at mcdonough.lafayette.edu. The link will be dropped in the chat shortly and also will be with the materials sent after the event. The McDonough Network essentially is an active, engaged networking organization consisting of multiple generations of Lafayette College Black alumni and students. The organization supports mentors current Black student body by encouraging their academic and social progress, promotes diversity among the student body. We'd love for you to join us in future events. So again, thank you so much for joining.
And thank you Lafayette for having me. It's always nice to revisit my alma mater and be home. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baily. I really appreciate the presentation, very informative. I do want to let everyone know, because we're getting a lot of questions in the chat, if this is going to be available. So yes, we have recorded it and it will be available. Tomorrow, you will all receive an email with a link for a survey. We ask that you fill that out. Let us know your thoughts on the presentation. Within that email, I'll also provide a link to where the recording of this will be. And if Dr. Baily allows, I'll include his email address, because I know a lot of you were looking for a lot of the materials that he presented this evening.
No problem. No problem.
Right, awesome. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate you joining us this evening. And I look forward to having conversations like this again.
Great. Good night, everyone.
Take care.